That night at my granddaughter's christening, my daughter-in-law poured a glass of champagne right in front of me and raised it to toast, while my son sat 3 chairs away, staring at his plate like a man who had forgotten what his own name was. And I understood right then that some families don't fall apart all at once. They're dismantled, piece by piece, until you can't recognize what's left. My name is Irene Castellano. I am 64 years old. I was a school principal for 22 years, and before that, a teacher who believed that every child deserves someone in their corner fighting for them. I raised my son to be gentle and strong. I raised him to open doors and mean it. I thought I did everything right. I was wrong about one thing. I taught him to be kind, but I forgot to warn him that kindness in the wrong hands looks like weakness. Let me tell you about my son first. Because what happened at that christening dinner was not the beginning. It was the middle of a story I had been watching unfold for 4 years without understanding what I was seeing. Liam was born on a February morning during a snowstorm so heavy the nurses couldn't get to the hospital on time. My husband, Arthur, delivered him himself, right there in our bedroom, and then sat on the edge of the bed holding this 7-pound boy with shaking hands and said, "Irene, I don't think I've ever been this terrified and this happy at the same time." We were both laughing and crying, and the snow was still falling outside, and everything felt like a miracle. Liam grew up the kind of boy who brought home injured birds and cried at the end of movies and read every book he could get his hands on. He was an engineer, not the flashy kind who wanted to build skyscrapers, the quiet kind who wanted to design water filtration systems for communities that didn't have clean water. He had a purpose. He had values. He had, I thought, very good judgment about people. He met Renata at a conference in Chicago. She was working in marketing for a pharmaceutical company. He called me that same night, which he never did from trips. And his voice had that particular note I remembered from when he was 9 years old and found a $10 bill on the playground and wanted to tell someone immediately. "Mom," he said, "I just had dinner with the most interesting woman I've ever met." I said, "Tell me about her." He told me she was sharp and funny and confident, and that she laughed at things most people didn't notice. He was already gone. I could hear it. I met Renata 3 months later. She was beautiful in a deliberate way, the kind of beautiful that takes effort and wants you to notice the effort. She shook my hand with both of hers and looked me right in the eye and said, "Liam talks about you constantly. I feel like I already know you." It was exactly the right thing to say. I should have paid more attention to how perfectly right it was. The wedding was in Savannah, at a venue with Spanish moss hanging from the oak trees and white lights everywhere. Arthur walked Liam down the aisle because we always joked that fathers need the walk too. Renata had a large family, loud and celebratory, and they filled that venue with a kind of energy that felt, on that day, like joy. It was joy, or something that looked just like it. The first year, things seemed fine. Liam and Renata bought a house in the suburbs of Atlanta, a large house, more house than 2 people need. But Renata wanted the neighborhood and the school district and the space for when we have children. Liam was still doing his engineering work, consulting remotely, traveling sometimes. Renata worked full-time. From the outside, they were the picture of a thriving young couple. I visited twice that first year. The house was immaculate in a way that made me slightly uneasy, the kind of clean that means someone is anxious, not just tidy. Liam seemed happy but tired. When I mentioned it, "You look worn out, sweetheart," he smiled and said they'd been busy settling in, that's all. He'd always been good at reassuring me. By the second year, I started noticing small things. Liam stopped calling me on Sundays, which had been our ritual since he left for college. When I called him instead, he often answered in a low voice and said he'd call me back, and sometimes he did and sometimes he didn't. When I asked if everything was all right, he said yes, they were just busy. Then he stopped coming to Christmas. That was the first year. Renata's family had a tradition, he explained, of spending Christmas in Florida with her parents. He was sorry. He'd make it up to me. Arthur was already sick by then, the early stages of the Parkinson's that would eventually take him. And I remember sitting at my dining room table with a place setting I'd laid out and didn't use, and feeling something shift inside me. Not anger yet, just a quiet, cold recognition. Arthur passed away 18 months later. Liam came to the funeral, of course, But Renata came for the service and left the same afternoon. She had a work commitment she couldn't reschedule. She was very sorry. She hugged me for exactly the right amount of time. Liam stayed 3 days. On the second night, we sat on the back porch, and I asked him gently how things really were. He looked at his hands for a long moment. "It's fine, Mom. It's a lot of adjusting. Marriage is adjustment." I nodded. I didn't push. I told myself I didn't want to make things harder for him. I should have pushed. The baby was born 14 months after Arthur died. A girl. They named her Claire, which had been Arthur's mother's name, and when Liam called to tell me, I wept and laughed at the same time, the way I had the morning he was born. The christening was scheduled for when Claire was 6 weeks old. Renata's parents were coming from Tampa. Her brother Marcus, the only name I remembered because he was the loudest presence in every room, was flying in from Denver. I drove up from Savannah with a gift I'd spent 3 weeks choosing, a silver bracelet engraved with Claire's name and birth date, the same kind my own mother had given me for my christening 64 years ago. The dinner was at a restaurant Renata had chosen. One of those places with a tasting menu and no prices on the menu, the kind of place that wants you to know you're spending money without making you confront the number directly. I arrived early. I always arrive early. Liam met me at the door. He looked thin. Not in the way new fathers look tired, in the way that something is slowly taking weight from the inside. I hugged him and felt his shoulder blades too sharp under my hands. "You look thin," I said. He smiled. "I'm fine, Mom." There it was again. We sat down. Renata's family arrived in a cluster, her parents and Marcus and his girlfriend, and the energy shifted immediately, became louder, more performative, tuned to Renata's frequency. She moved through the room, greeting everyone with that same confident ease, the laugh at exactly the right moment, the comment that lands just right. I was seated at the far end of the table, between Marcus's girlfriend, whose name I've since forgotten, and an empty chair that stayed empty all night. Liam was seated next to Renata, which is natural, of course. But when the waiter came to take drink orders, and Liam started to speak, Renata finished his sentence. "He'll have sparkling water. He's not drinking tonight." She said it pleasantly, as if she were doing him a service. Liam didn't protest. He just looked at his menu. I noticed. I filed it away. The dinner proceeded. Renata's father gave a toast. Marcus gave a toast. Renata gave a long, polished speech about motherhood and new chapters. At no point did anyone suggest that Liam might want to say something. When he began to speak up during a lull, I saw him take a breath, open his mouth. Renata touched his arm and said, "Oh, the waiter is here. Let's order." And the moment closed. He didn't try again. And then came the moment I keep returning to, the one that cracked something open in me that hasn't closed since. Claire was being passed around the table, dressed in white lace, alert and blinking at all these faces. She came to me and I held her, this 6-week-old with Liam's eyes and whatever history her parents were writing for her. And I was saying something soft to her when I heard Renata's voice from across the table, light and easy. "Oh, she doesn't like to be held like that, Irene. She gets fussy. Here." And she reached over and lifted Claire out of my arms efficiently, the way you might correct a child who is holding scissors wrong. The table went quiet for a half-second. Renata's mother laughed. "Renata's so protective, it's sweet." And the conversation moved on. But I looked at Liam. He was looking at his plate. His jaw was tight. He knew. He knew it was wrong, and he said nothing. And in his silence, I heard every Sunday call he hadn't made, and every Christmas he'd missed, and every thin-shouldered hug, and I understood that this was not new. This had been happening slowly and thoroughly for years. I drove home to Savannah that night. I sat in my car in the driveway for a long time before going inside. I held Arthur's old cardigan that I keep folded on the passenger seat sometimes. I know how that sounds, but I don't care, and I talked to him the way I still do. "Arthur," I said, "I think we have a problem." I didn't sleep. In the following weeks, I started paying a different kind of attention. I called Liam on a Wednesday morning, the kind of time Renata would normally be at work. He answered. We talked for 40 minutes, the longest conversation we'd had in 2 years. Near the end, I asked casually whether he was happy. Long pause. "I love Renata." "I love Claire." That's not what I asked. Another pause. I don't know how to answer that, Mom. That was enough. That was everything. I started educating myself. I found a therapist who specialized in family systems, a woman named Dr. Bess who specialized in family systems. Okafor, sharp and no nonsense, who helped me understand what I was seeing without letting me spiral into worst-case scenarios before I had facts. She told me something that stayed with me. You can't rescue someone who doesn't know they're drowning, but you can be on the shore when they figure it out. I wrote that down. I taped it to my refrigerator. I also started, carefully, keeping a record. Dates of calls. What was said. What wasn't said. Patterns. The engineer's daughter in me wanted documentation, even if I didn't know yet what I was documenting for. It was 8 months after the christening when things changed. Liam called me. Not on a Wednesday morning this time, on a Saturday night. Late, after 11. I answered immediately. His voice sounded like a man who had been holding something heavy for a very long time and had just set it down and didn't know what to do with his empty hands. "Mom," he said, "can I tell you something? Of course." "Always." He told me. Not all of it, not that night. There was too much, and he'd been carrying it so long he didn't know where to start. But the outline came out, how Renata controlled their joint finances, keeping his paycheck on a household budget she managed, while her own income went into a separate account he had no access to. How she had, over the course of 2 years, gradually ended his friendships, not dramatically, but through scheduling conflicts and cool responses until his friends stopped being invited and eventually stopped trying. How she monitored his phone. How she had, twice, threatened that if he ever made trouble, she would make sure Claire grew up hearing a particular version of what kind of father he was. I sat with the phone pressed against my ear, and I was perfectly still. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, not accusingly. I needed to understand. Because I kept thinking it would get better. Because I was embarrassed. Because every time I thought about saying it out loud, I thought, who's going to believe this is happening to a man? People think. He stopped. I don't know what people think. I just know I believed for a long time that it was my fault, that I was the problem. I had heard those words before. I had heard them from students, from parents, from women in our community who came to me when they had nowhere else to go. I had never expected to hear them from my son. "It is not your fault," I said. "Do you hear me? What she is doing has a name. It is financial abuse. It is isolation. It is coercive control. None of it is your fault." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I just want to be a good father to Claire." "Then let's make sure you get to be one." The following weeks were the most careful of my life. I was dealing with a situation that had particular complications, a man who had been conditioned to doubt himself, a young child whose well-being was paramount, and a woman who was, by all accounts, intelligent and strategic and very good at presenting a certain face to the outside world. I consulted with Dr. Okafor. I found a family law attorney in Atlanta, a man named Mr. Reeves who had handled cases involving financial abuse and coercive control in divorce proceedings. I learned more than I ever wanted to know about documentation and discovery and what constitutes evidence in a family court in Georgia. Mr. Reeves told me, "What you're describing is increasingly recognized by courts, but it requires documentation. Patterns, not incidents. We need him to be willing to come forward and to have kept records." He hadn't kept records, but I had mine, and slowly, Liam began to remember dates and amounts and messages he had deleted because he'd been told to. Renata did not know any of this was happening. She knew that I had become less warm toward her over the past several months. I'd noticed her noticing that. But I was careful. I was not hostile. I was not dramatic. I was a 64-year-old woman who had managed a school of 400 children for 2 decades. And I knew how to play a long game. What I was not prepared for was the phone call from her mother. Renata's mother called me one Tuesday morning. Very pleasant voice. Very measured words. She said she was calling because she was worried about Renata, about the marriage, about me. She said she'd heard I was putting ideas in Liam's head. She said that all marriages had difficulties and that the thing to do was to support them, not interfere. I listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When she was finished, I said, very calmly, "Thank you for calling. I appreciate you sharing your perspective." And I hung up. Then I called Mr. Reeves. Liam filed for divorce 3 months later. He had, by then, opened a new account at a bank, where he was not a joint holder with Renata. He had consulted with Mr. Reeves. He had a therapist of his own, a man who specialized in male survivors of domestic abuse, because that is what this was, regardless of how unfamiliar that phrase felt to everyone involved. The morning he served the papers, he called me first. His voice was shaking. "Mom, I did it. I know. How do you feel?" "Terrified. And like I can breathe?" "That's exactly right," I said. "That's exactly how it should feel." Renata's response was immediate and strategic. She called her attorney. She froze as many shared assets as she could reach. She also, within the week, began what I can only describe as a campaign, text to Liam's colleagues suggesting he was not in a stable place, messages to mutual acquaintances, a social media post about going through something privately that carefully centered her as the person in pain. Her brother Marcus called Liam. I only know the content of that call because Liam told me afterward, his voice flat with exhaustion. Marcus said that Liam was throwing his family away, that Renata had sacrificed her career trajectory to have Claire, that Liam should remember what he owed her. And then Marcus said something that I have not forgiven and will not forget. He said, "Men don't get to play victim. That's not how this works." I had to set the phone down after Liam told me that. I had to stand at my kitchen window and look at the yard for several minutes. Then I picked it up and said, "He's wrong. He is completely wrong. And I need you to let those words move through you and out the other side without sticking." The divorce proceedings took 11 months. Georgia law on equitable distribution gave Liam rights to marital assets that Renata had been treating as hers alone. Mr. Reeves was meticulous. The documentation we had built told a clear story. Text messages Renata had sent over 3 years, retrieved through discovery, told an even clearer one. There was a moment in one of the mediation sessions, Liam told me about it that evening, when Renata looked across the table at him and said, "I don't know who you think you are right now, but you're going to regret this." Her voice was entirely calm. Her attorney touched her arm, and Liam said, "My quiet, kind son who cried at the ends of movies and wanted to build clean water systems," he said, "I know exactly who I am. I've been remembering." The settlement gave him joint custody of Claire, alternating weeks. The financial settlement was equitable, in the legal sense of the word. He got back a portion of what had been systematically moved out of his reach. Not everything, but enough to start. The first weekend he had Claire on his own, he drove her down to Savannah to visit me. She was 14 months old by then, pulling herself up on furniture and delighted with everything. We sat in my backyard in the afternoon light and she crawled through the grass and I watched my son watch his daughter. And for the first time in years, he looked like himself. "Mom," he said, "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner." "Don't," I said. "Just be here now." He nodded. Claire grabbed a fistful of grass and offered it to him with great seriousness. He accepted it like it was a gift. It has been 2 years since the divorce was finalized. Liam is in therapy, still, consistently, because healing doesn't have a finish line. He's returned to his work with a clarity I hadn't seen since before the marriage. He has rebuilt, slowly, some of the friendships that were lost. His old college roommate flew down last spring, and they spent a weekend fishing and came back sunburned and quieter in a good way. Claire is 3 now. She calls me Nana, and she has her father's laugh. She spends half her time with Liam and half with Renata, and she is, as best as anyone can tell, a happy child. What she learns in each household is not my control. But what she learns in my son's home, that is something I feel cautiously good about. Renata and I do not speak. We were never close enough for there to be something to grieve. At pickup and drop-off, Liam tells me they are civil. That is the right word. Civil is enough. Her brother Marcus sent Liam a text 9 months after the divorce, something brief and awkward that said he hoped things were going okay. Liam showed it to me and asked what he should do with it. I said, "That's entirely up to you." He ended up not responding. "Maybe someday. That's not my call. What I think about now in the evenings when I sit on the back porch where Arthur used to sit and watch the yard go golden in the late light, I think about what I almost didn't do. I almost didn't push that Wednesday morning when Liam went quiet after I asked if he was happy. I almost told myself it wasn't my place. I almost believed that my role was to stay out of my adult son's marriage no matter what I saw. I'm grateful I didn't. I'm grateful every single day. I am not a dramatic person. I am a school principal who became a retired school principal and who tends her garden and reads thick novels and still drives herself to her own appointments. Thank you very much. I did not do anything heroic. I stayed on the shore. I kept the light on. I learned what I needed to learn and found the people who knew more than I did, and I let my son find his own way to the water. But I want to say this plainly, because I know there are other people sitting in the same confusion, watching someone they love from a careful distance and wondering if what they're seeing is real. It is real. If it feels wrong, it's worth a closer look. Abuse doesn't always look like what we've been taught to recognize. It doesn't always come with bruises. Sometimes it looks like a woman taking a baby from her grandmother's arms with a pleasant smile. Sometimes it looks like a grown man who's forgotten how to make a phone call without checking over his shoulder. You don't need to blow anything up to help someone. Sometimes you just need to be steady, available, documented, and willing to say out loud what you see. If my son needed to hear that he was not imagining it, that what was happening had a name, that he was not alone, then that is what I was there to say. I would say it again. I would do all of it again. Claire's coming this weekend. Liam is dropping her off Friday evening and picking her up Sunday. We are going to bake something, she and I, because she has recently become very interested in what happens to things in the oven, which I consider an excellent instinct. I have already bought the sprinkles. Arthur would have loved her completely and beyond reason. I think he knows. If this story sounds familiar, if you are watching someone you love from a distance and something is pulling at you that you can't quite name, please don't wait as long as I almost did. Write to me in the comments. I read every one. And if there's a woman or a man sitting somewhere right now who needs to hear that what they're living through is not their fault, I hope this finds them. I hope it helps. Until next time, take care of the people you love, and take care of yourself first so you can. I've had a lot of time to think about what Renata built inside my son's life, and what I've come to understand is this. Control doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a raised fist or a slammed door. It arrives quietly, wearing the face of preference, of practicality, of love. It says, he'll have sparkling water tonight. It says, she doesn't like to be held that way. It rearranges a person's life so gradually that the person being rearranged doesn't notice they've stopped recognizing themselves until one Saturday night, past 11, something in them finally breaks loose enough to make a phone call. What Liam lived through was real. It had a name. And the fact that it happened to a man and that the people around him, including for a while, me, found it harder to see because of that, is something I will carry with me for a long time. Not with guilt. Exactly. With clarity, the kind that comes from having almost looked away and choosing not to. What I keep returning to is the question of cause and consequence, not in any mystical sense, but in the plainest human one. Renata made choices. She chose to control rather than connect. She chose strategy over honesty, accumulation over partnership. And those choices produced a specific outcome. A man who remembered who he was, a legal record that documented exactly what she'd done, and a settlement that reflected the truth rather than the story she'd been telling. She was intelligent and she was strategic, and none of that protected her from the consequences of what she'd actually done. Intelligence without integrity is just a sharper tool for digging your own hole. Liam made choices too. The hardest ones came late, after years of not making them, but they came. He opened a bank account, he called a lawyer, he called me. And those choices, quiet, terrifying, made at 11 o'clock on a Saturday night, changed everything that followed. That's what I want people to understand. The moment you decide to act honestly, even when you're frightened, even when you don't know how it will turn out, the story begins to change. I'm a retired school principal. For 22 years, my work was about what you build in people when they're young. The habits of honesty, the willingness to say something hard, the understanding that how you treat other people is not incidental to your character, it is your character. Renata's brother Marcus told my son that men don't get to call themselves victims. That one sentence revealed everything about what he'd been taught and everything about why he was wrong. Dignity is not a gendered category. Harm is not a gendered category, and the courage it takes to name what's happening to you and ask for help. That belongs to anyone with enough honesty and enough nerve to reach for it. Claire is 3 years old. She doesn't know any of this yet, but she will grow up watching her father live with integrity, watching him rebuild friendships he was told to abandon, watching him show up consistently, not perfectly but honestly. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything. What we model for children is the longest-lasting thing we ever do. Arthur would have said something simpler than all of this. He would have said, "You do right by people, and you make sure the people you love are okay." That was his whole philosophy, stated in one sentence in 22 years of marriage. I've needed more words to find my way to the same place, but I got there, and I'm still here, on the shore, keeping the light on.